The scream shattered the sterile silence of St. Mary's Hospital like breaking glass. Nurse Jenkins stumbled backward, her trembling hand pressed against her mouth, eyes wide with the kind of terror Sarah Miller had only seen once before. In her own mirror, the day Western Union knocked on her door in 1969. Dr. Thompson's surgical gloves hit the linoleum floor with a wet slap. In 40 years of emergency medicine, he'd seen everything. Vietnam-era shrapnel in elderly chests, cancers that bloomed like black roses. But this, whatever lay beneath the infected tissue behind Sarah's neck, made his coffee-steady hands shake like autumn leaves. "What is it?" Sarah's voice cracked, each word a prayer wrapped in fear. "What do you see?" The doctor's face had gone pale as winter snow, his eyes reflecting something that shouldn't exist in the fluorescent-lit reality of modern medicine. "Mrs. Miller," he whispered, "we need to understand how we got here. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Sarah Elizabeth Miller had awakened to the same Iowa dawn that had greeted her for 68 years. The farmhouse kitchen still smelled of Robert's morning coffee, though he'd been gone 2 years now, taken by the Agent Orange that had followed him home from Vietnam like a patient, invisible enemy. She moved through her morning ritual with the precision of a woman who understood that routine was armor against grief. Coffee at 5 sharp, brewed in the same blue percolator Robert had bought at the hardware store in 1972. Toast, with strawberry jam from berries she'd canned last summer. The local news crackling from the radio he'd refused to replace, its antenna held upright with electrical tape and stubborn hope. Sarah's reflection in the hallway mirror showed a woman carved from Iowa soil, silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, hands steady from 45 years of nursing, eyes that had seen babies born and soldiers die. She wore Robert's purple flannel shirt over her white blouse, the sleeves rolled up to reveal arms still strong enough to lift hay bales when the Kowalski boys weren't around to help. The house itself told their story in quiet details. Wedding photos from 1972, when Robert returned from Southeast Asia with haunted eyes and a purple heart he kept in the kitchen drawer beneath the dish towels. His reading glasses still folded on the table beside his favorite chair. The Victory Garden outside the kitchen window, where she grew tomatoes and beans with the same determination their mothers had shown during the war. Emma called every Sunday at 9, sharp as church bells. Their daughter had inherited Robert's precision and Sarah's stubbornness, channeling both into a successful career as a trauma surgeon in Chicago. But success had carved distance between them. Emma spoke in medical terms about assisted living facilities and safety concerns, while Sarah countered with prairie wisdom about independence and dying in your own bed. The community of Cedar Falls moved around Sarah like water around a stone. Mrs. Kowalski brought casseroles and gossip. Father Murphy saved her the third pew at St. Agnes, where she played organ for Sunday service. The young mothers at the grocery store called her Mrs. Miller, with the reverence reserved for teachers and war widows. Her days followed patterns established over decades, tending the garden Robert had planted, volunteering at the church food pantry, reading library books in his chair while evening news played to an empty room. She talked to his photograph each night before bed, sharing daily details he would never hear, maintaining conversations that death had interrupted but not ended. This was Sarah's world. Small, predictable, bounded by county lines and sustained by faith. She had survived the loss of the only man she'd ever loved, raised a daughter who'd grown beyond her reach, and built a life from the pieces left behind. She believed she understood survival. She had no idea that survival was about to be redefined. The morning Sarah first noticed the bump, autumn had painted Cedar Falls in shades of gold and crimson. She stood before her bathroom mirror, the same ritual that had anchored her days since Robert's funeral, brushing her silver hair with the tortoiseshell brush that had belonged to his mother. The Iowa light streaming through lace curtains caught something different in her reflection. Behind her left ear, just where her hairline met her neck, a small raised area disrupted the familiar landscape of her skin. No bigger than a pencil eraser, it felt warm under her fingertips, not painful, just present in a way that made her pause. Sarah had spent 45 years as a nurse. She knew the difference between something and nothing. This was something. Probably just a bug bite, she murmured to Robert's photograph on the dresser, the same tone she'd used to dismiss his worries about strange lumps and persistent coughs before the cancer took him. You know how those mosquitoes are this time of year. She dabbed the area with apple cider vinegar, her grandmother's cure-all, and forgot about it until 3 days later when Mrs. Kowalski mentioned that Sarah seemed to be favoring her left side while hanging laundry. "Just a crick in my neck," Sarah lied, her fingers unconsciously touching the spot that had grown from pencil eraser to marble size. The bump had darkened too, taking on the color of autumn leaves, reddish-brown with deeper shadows that seemed to shift in different light. By the second week, Sarah had begun wearing scarves to church. The fashionable explanation satisfied the church ladies, but Mrs. Kowalski's Polish mother instincts weren't fooled. She cornered Sarah after Sunday service, her weathered hands gentle but insistent as she examined the carefully arranged silk. "You're hiding something," she said in the direct way of women who'd buried husbands and raised children through depression and war. "Don't think I can't see the signs." Sarah's defensive laugh sounded hollow in the empty sanctuary. "Hiding what? It's just a little skin irritation, nothing that won't heal with time and prayer." But time wasn't healing anything. The area had developed a smell, metallic and sweet like the scent that had clung to Robert's uniform when he'd come home from the war. Sarah found herself checking it compulsively the way she'd once checked his Purple Heart in the kitchen drawer, needing to confirm it was still there, still real. Emma's Sunday call came with its usual precision, but this time Sarah's voice carried something her daughter's medical training recognized immediately, the careful modulation of someone hiding pain. "Mom, you sound tired. Are you feeling all right?" "Just fine, sweetheart. You know how harvest season wears on me." Sarah touched her neck as she spoke, a gesture that would have alarmed Emma if she could have seen it. "Though I do have a little skin issue." "Nothing serious." The silence on Emma's end stretched longer than usual. In Chicago, Dr. Emma Miller Harrison leaned forward in her office chair, her surgeon's instincts prickling. "What kind of skin issue?" "Oh, just a little bump. Probably from working in the garden. You know how clumsy I get around the roses." "Mom?" Emma's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to life and death decisions. "When did this start? How big is it? Is it changing color or shape?" Sarah's laugh was forced. "Honestly, Emma, I raised you without running to doctors for every little thing. I think I can handle a bug bite." "It's not about what you can handle," Emma said, her professional calm cracking slightly. "It's about being smart. Skin changes at your age can be what? Serious? Fatal?" Sarah's voice rose, surprising them both. "I've survived worse than a little rash, young lady." "I survived losing your father, didn't I?" The conversation ended in strained politeness, but Emma's unease followed her through the rest of her shift at Chicago Memorial. She'd seen too many patients whose little nothing had become everything. That night, she called Mrs. Kowalski. "She's being stubborn," Mrs. Kowalski confirmed. "Wearing scarves in 80-degree weather, pretending everything's fine. You know your mother. She'd rather die than admit weakness." Emma's blood chilled at the word die. She made a decision that would strain their relationship further but might save her mother's life. "I'm driving down this weekend. Don't tell her I called." Meanwhile, Sarah's condition worsened with autumn's progression. The bump had spread, creating an irregular patch of discolored skin that felt hot to the touch. She found herself exhausted by simple tasks: Climbing the stairs left her breathless, and her appetite had disappeared like summer birds heading south. The fever started on a Thursday night. Sarah woke drenched in sweat, her nightgown clinging to skin that felt like it was burning from within. She stumbled to the bathroom, gripping the door frame as dizziness threatened to topple her. In the mirror, her reflection looked like a stranger, pale, hollow-eyed, with the telltale flush of infection painting her cheeks. The affected area behind her neck had changed again. What had been merely discolored was now actively angry, red streaks radiating outward like spider legs, the skin tight and shiny with inflammation. When she pressed it gently, clear fluid seeped from tiny openings she hadn't noticed before. For the first time since Robert's diagnosis, Sarah felt truly afraid. Friday morning brought Emma's unannounced arrival. She found her mother sitting at the kitchen table, still in her nightgown at 10 in the morning, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. "Mom?" Emma's medical training kicked in immediately, cataloging symptoms with clinical efficiency: pale, diaphoretic, signs of systemic infection. "How long have you been feeling like this?" Sarah looked up with eyes that held too much brightness. Fever eyes, Emma realized with growing alarm. "Just a little under the weather. Nothing rest won't cure." Emma moved behind her mother's chair, her hands gentle but insistent as she lifted the silver hair. What she saw made her breath catch. The infection covered an area the size of her palm, with characteristic signs of cellulitis spreading toward the spine. Worse, she could see what looked like foreign material beneath the inflamed tissue. "Mom, we need to get you to a doctor. Now." "I don't need—" "This isn't a discussion." Emma's voice carried the authority of emergency rooms and life-or-death decisions. "This is a serious infection. If it spreads to your bloodstream, it could kill you." Sarah's resistance crumbled in the face of her daughter's certainty. She'd spent too many years in hospitals not to recognize the tone doctors used when time was running short. "How bad is it really?" Emma knelt beside her mother's chair, taking weathered hands in her own steady ones. "Bad enough that we can't wait for Monday morning. Bad enough that we're going to the emergency room right now." The drive to Cedar Falls General felt like a journey through Sarah's entire life. Past the church where she and Robert had married, past the school where Emma had taken her first steps in kindergarten, past the cemetery where Robert's headstone waited patiently for her name to join his. Dr. Patterson had been their family physician for 30 years. He'd delivered Emma, treated Robert's war injuries, and signed the death certificate that had made Sarah a widow. His examination was thorough and increasingly concerned. "Sarah, I need to ask you some questions about your medical history. Have you ever had any foreign objects embedded in your skin? Any injuries that might have left debris behind?" Sarah shook her head, confusion mixing with fever. "Foreign objects? I don't understand." Dr. Patterson's fingers probed the infected area with practiced gentleness. "There's definitely something beneath the tissue here, something that doesn't belong. It's what's causing the infection. Your body is trying to reject whatever's been embedded there." Emma leaned forward, her medical curiosity overriding her personal fear. "What kind of foreign material?" "Hard to say without imaging, but it feels metallic. Could be old shrapnel, surgical clips from a previous procedure, even something as simple as a deeply embedded splinter that's been there for years." The word shrapnel hung in the air like smoke from an old fire. Sarah's mind raced through decades of memory, searching for injuries that might explain this medical mystery. But her past held only the ordinary traumas of farm life: cuts from broken canning jars, burns from kitchen accidents, the inevitable scrapes that came from living close to the land. "I need to transfer you to Iowa City Medical Center," Dr. Patterson said finally. "They have the surgical specialists and imaging equipment we'll need to figure this out. This infection is too aggressive for what we can handle here." As the ambulance pulled away from Cedar Falls General, Sarah watched her life shrink to a view through small windows. The familiar landmarks of her world, the grain elevator, the water tower painted with the high school mascot, the cemetery where 3 generations of her family lay waiting, fell behind like chapters in a book she might never finish reading. Emma rode beside her, holding her hand with a grip that felt like prayer. The emergency department at Iowa City Medical Center hummed with the controlled chaos that Emma remembered from her residency training. She watched her mother's stretcher disappear behind curtains marked Trauma Bay 3, feeling the familiar helplessness that came with being a doctor's family member rather than the doctor herself. Dr. Catherine Reynolds emerged from the treatment area 20 minutes later, her expression carrying the careful neutrality that Emma recognized as barely contained concern. They'd known each other during Emma's surgical training. Reynolds had been the attending physician who'd taught her that sometimes the most important diagnostic tool was knowing when to be worried. "Emma, I need to speak with you privately," Dr. Reynolds said, guiding her toward a small consultation room that smelled of disinfectant and difficult conversations. "How bad is it?" Emma asked, her medical training warring with her daughter's fear. "The infection is more extensive than Dr. Patterson initially thought. It's spread along fascial planes. We're looking at necrotizing fasciitis. If we'd waited another 12 hours... Dr. Reynolds let the implication hang unspoken between them. Emma's breath caught. Necrotizing fasciitis, flesh-eating disease. She'd seen patients lose limbs, lose lives to infections that moved like wildfire through tissue. Treatment options? Aggressive surgical debridement, high-dose antibiotics, and prayer, Reynolds said bluntly. "But Emma, there's something else. The imaging shows extensive foreign material embedded in the infected tissue. Metal fragments, arranged in what appears to be a deliberate pattern." "What kind of pattern?" Dr. Reynolds pulled up the CT scan on her tablet, the black and white images stark against the screen. "Look at this. The fragments aren't randomly distributed. They're arranged linearly, almost like letters or symbols." Emma studied the images, her surgeon's eye picking out details that would have escaped a layperson. The metallic shadows did indeed form what looked like deliberate shapes, as if someone had carefully placed them beneath her mother's skin. That's impossible. She's never had surgery in that area, never been in an accident. "I know it sounds far-fetched, but the evidence is right here. These fragments have been there for decades, based on the tissue reaction around them. They're not recent." A knock interrupted their conversation. A young resident appeared in the doorway holding a manila folder. "Dr. Reynolds, you asked me to research similar cases in the medical literature. I found something you need to see." The resident spread photocopied journal articles across the consultation table. There have been documented cases of foreign material appearing in family members of combat veterans. Usually through close physical contact over extended periods, sharing blood through cuts, intimate contact during medical care. Emma felt her world tilt slightly. "You're suggesting my father somehow transferred battlefield debris to my mother?" "It's rare, but documented," the resident continued. "During the Vietnam era, many veterans came home with embedded shrapnel that their bodies never fully rejected. In some cases, fragments worked their way to the surface and were transferred to family members through accidental cuts or shared blood." Dr. Reynolds studied the CT images again. "Emma, I need to ask you about your father's military service. Did he have any documented shrapnel injuries?" Emma's mind raced through childhood memories. Her father's careful way of moving, his reluctance to discuss the war, the Purple Heart hidden in the kitchen drawer. "He was wounded in Vietnam." "I know he carried shrapnel, but he never talked about the details." "We need those military medical records," Dr. Reynolds said. "If we can match the metallic composition of what's in your mother's tissue to battlefield ordnance from your father's service, it might explain how this happened." Emma nodded, already mentally composing the request she'd need to file. What about the surgery? How soon? We're taking her up now. This can't wait. Dr. Reynolds stood, her expression softening slightly. Emma, I want you to prepare yourself. We don't know how extensive the debridement will need to be. In worst-case scenarios, we might be looking at significant tissue loss, possible nerve damage. The operating room waiting area became Emma's world for the next 6 hours. She called Mrs. Kowalski, who promised to contact the church prayer chain. She filed requests for her father's military records, using her medical credentials to expedite the process. Most importantly, she sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair and confronted the possibility that she might lose her mother to an enemy that had followed her father home from a war that ended before Emma was born. At 3:17 a.m., Dr. Reynolds emerged from the surgical suite, still wearing scrubs that bore evidence of the battle fought inside. Her expression was unreadable as she approached Emma, who had been pacing the waiting room like a caged animal. She's stable, Dr. Reynolds said, and Emma felt her knees nearly buckle with relief. But Emma, what we found in there, I've never seen anything like it in 40 years of surgery. What do you mean? Dr. Reynolds sat down heavily, as if the weight of what she'd witnessed had physically exhausted her. The metal fragments weren't just embedded randomly, they were arranged in a specific pattern, and when we extracted them, they spelled out a word. Emma's blood chilled. What word? Sarah. The fragments spelled out your mother's name in rough block letters, as if someone had deliberately placed them there. The impossibility of it struck Emma like a physical blow. That can't be right. How could battlefield shrapnel arrange itself into letters? It couldn't, Dr. Reynolds said quietly. Which means either we're dealing with the most extraordinary medical coincidence in history, or there's something about your parents' story that you don't know. Emma sank into the chair beside Dr. Reynolds, her medical training struggling to process what she just heard. Can I see the fragments? They're being analyzed by the pathology lab. But Emma, there's something else. We found organic material embedded with the metal, tissue that doesn't match your mother's blood type. Whose tissue? That's what we need to find out. The lab is running DNA analysis, but it'll take a few days for results. Dr. Reynolds paused, studying Emma's face. I think it's time you went through your father's personal effects, really went through them, because something tells me the answers we need are there. Emma nodded numbly, her thoughts turning to the cardboard box in her mother's attic, the one containing her father's war letters that her mother had never opened. She'd respected her mother's wishes to leave the past buried, but the past was literally eating her mother alive. When can I see her? She's in recovery now. The anesthesia should wear off in an hour or two. Emma, Dr. Reynolds placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. She's going to need extensive wound care and monitoring for secondary infection. But if we hadn't operated when we did, she wouldn't have survived the night. As Emma walked toward the recovery unit, her phone buzzed with a text from the military records office. Her request had been expedited. Her father's complete service record would be available for pickup the next morning. Somewhere in those pages she hoped to find explanations that made sense of the impossible. Sarah lay in the recovery bed looking smaller than Emma had ever seen her, machines monitoring her vital signs with electronic vigilance. A large surgical dressing covered the left side of her neck, white gauze stark against skin that looked fragile as parchment. Emma took her mother's hand, feeling the familiar calluses from decades of farm work and medical care. I'm here, Mom. You're going to be okay. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, still cloudy from anesthesia, but focusing on her daughter's face. Emma? Her voice was barely a whisper. What happened to me? You had an infection, but the doctors fixed it. You need to rest now. Sarah's fingers tightened weakly around Emma's hand. I dreamed about your father. He was trying to tell me something important, but I couldn't understand the words. Emma felt tears threaten for the first time since the ordeal began. What do you think he was trying to say? Something about promises, Sarah murmured, her eyes drifting closed again. Something about keeping promises to people whose names we never knew. As her mother slipped back into healing sleep, Emma stared out the hospital window at the Iowa dawn breaking over fields that had witnessed generations of her family's joys and sorrows. Somewhere in the fragments, now being analyzed in the lab below, in the military records waiting for pickup, in the letters her mother had never read, lay the truth about how a war fought 50 years ago had nearly claimed another casualty. The turning point had arrived, though Emma didn't yet realize that everything she thought she knew about her family was about to change forever. The Military Records Office in Iowa City occupied a stark government building that smelled of old paper and bureaucratic efficiency. Emma arrived when the doors opened at 8 a.m., her mother's medical authorization forms clutched in hands that hadn't stopped shaking since the surgery. The clerk, a middle-aged woman with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to families seeking answers about wars that had ended decades ago, handed her a thick manila envelope marked Classified Medical Records, Robert James Miller. Emma didn't open the envelope until she was back in her rental car. Her hands trembled as she broke the official seal and spread the documents across the passenger seat. Her father's military photograph stared back at her, a young man barely older than she was now, wearing dress blues and an expression of determined innocence that the war would later strip away. The service record painted a picture of heroism and horror in equal measure. Robert had enlisted straight out of high school, trained as a field medic, and deployed to Vietnam in January 1969. His unit, the 1st Infantry Division, had seen heavy combat throughout the Tet Offensive aftermath. The medical reports documented multiple injuries, shrapnel wounds from mortar attacks, a broken arm from a helicopter crash, and finally, the injuries that earned him his Purple Heart and a ticket home. The incident report was dated March 15, 1969. Emma read it twice before the full impact hit her. Robert's unit had been overrun during a night attack near Cu Chi. In the chaos, their field hospital had taken a direct hit from rocket-propelled grenades. Robert had been treating wounded when the explosion occurred, embedding multiple metal fragments in his back and shoulder. But that wasn't what made Emma's breath catch. According to the report, Robert had been performing CPR on a critically wounded Army nurse when the explosion happened. The nurse, listed as KIA, killed in action, had been identified as Specialist Sarah Elizabeth Miller, Army Nurse Corps, age 19. Emma stared at the name until the letters blurred. Her mother's exact name, her mother's maiden name. It was impossible, yet there it was in official military records. A young woman who shared her mother's name had died in her father's arms on a battlefield 50 years ago. She called Dr. Reynolds immediately. I found something in my father's records. There was another Sarah Miller in Vietnam, an Army nurse who died the same night my father was wounded. Emma, slow down. What exactly are you saying? My father was treating a nurse named Sarah Miller when they were both hit by shrapnel. She died. He survived. Dr. Reynolds, what if the fragments in my mother's neck came from that other Sarah? The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably long. Emma, that's medically impossible. Metal fragments can't transfer between people who never met. But what if they did meet? What if somehow... Emma stopped, realizing how her theory sounded. I know it doesn't make sense, but the DNA results on the organic material, when will those be ready? This afternoon. Emma, I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that this is an extraordinary coincidence. People sharing names, isn't that unusual? Emma hung up, but she couldn't shake the feeling that coincidence didn't explain the metal fragments spelling out her mother's name. She drove back to the hospital, her mind racing through possibilities that defied medical logic. Sarah was awake when Emma entered her room, propped up against pillows and looking more alert than she had since the surgery. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Sarah said, studying her daughter's face with the perceptive eye of a woman who'd spent decades reading symptoms in patients' expressions. "Mom, I need to ask you about Dad's military service. Did he ever mention other people he served with? Other medical personnel?" Sarah's expression grew cautious. "He didn't talk much about the war." "You know that. Why are you asking?" Emma pulled up a chair beside the hospital bed. "I found his military records. There was someone else there. Someone with your name. An Army nurse who died the same night Dad was wounded." Sarah's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" "Her name was Sarah Miller. She was 19, serving as an Army nurse in Vietnam. She died in combat the same night Dad got his Purple Heart." Emma watched her mother's reaction carefully. "Mom, did Dad ever mention her?" Sarah was quiet for so long that Emma wondered if she'd fallen asleep. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "There was a box in the attic. Letters he wrote but never sent. I never opened them because I was afraid of what I might find." "What kind of letters?" "He wrote them when he couldn't sleep, when the nightmares were bad. He'd sit at the kitchen table for hours, writing page after page, then he'd fold them up and put them in that box." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I thought they were love letters to someone else, someone he met over there." Emma felt pieces of an impossible puzzle beginning to form a picture. "Mom, I think we need to read those letters." "I can't. I've spent 50 years not knowing what's in them. I can't start now. You almost died from something connected to Dad's war. Whatever's in those letters might explain what happened to you." Emma reached for her mother's hand. "You don't have to read them alone." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Reynolds appeared in the doorway holding a folder that Emma recognized as lab results. Her expression was grave as she approached the bed. "Mrs. Miller, Emma, I have the DNA analysis of the organic material we found embedded with the metal fragments." Dr. Reynolds sat down, the gesture itself suggesting the weight of what she was about to reveal. "The tissue samples contain DNA from 2 different individuals, neither of whom is you, Mrs. Miller." Emma leaned forward. "What do you mean, 2 individuals?" "One sample matches DNA we have on file for your father, Robert Miller. The other—" Dr. Reynolds paused, consulting her notes. "The other belongs to someone identified in military records as Specialist Sarah Elizabeth Miller, Army Nurse Corps, deceased March 1969. The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of Sarah's heart monitor. Emma stared at the lab results, her medical training struggling to process information that seemed to violate everything she knew about biology and physics. "How is that possible?" Sarah whispered. "How can a dead person's DNA be inside me?" Dr. Reynolds shook her head. "I've consulted with pathologists across the country. No one has seen anything like this. The only theory that makes any medical sense is that your husband somehow carried both his own tissue and tissue from the deceased nurse for 50 years, and that material was transferred to you through intimate contact." Emma thought about her parents' marriage. 50 years of shared meals, shared beds, shared blood through countless small cuts and scrapes of farm life. "Blood transfusion," she said suddenly. "During the war. If Dad received blood from the other Sarah before she died, and then shared blood with Mom through accidents over the years, it's theoretically possible," Dr. Reynolds said slowly, "though the preservation of genetic material over such a long period would be unprecedented." Sarah struggled to sit up straighter. "Are you telling me I've been carrying a dead stranger's blood for 50 years?" "Not a stranger," Emma said quietly. Someone Dad tried to save. Someone who died in his arms. She looked at her mother with new understanding. Mom, I think Dad spent his whole life carrying guilt about not being able to save her, and somehow, literally, carrying part of her. Sarah's tears came then, 50 years of questions finally finding focus. All those nights he couldn't sleep. All those times he'd look at me like he was seeing someone else. He was seeing her, wasn't he? I think he was seeing both of you, Emma said gently. I think he loved you both, in different ways. And I think the letters in that box will tell us how. Dr. Reynolds stood to leave, sensing this had become a family conversation that medicine couldn't address. Mrs. Miller, your surgical sites are healing well. If there are no complications, we should be able to discharge you tomorrow. But I want you to understand, whatever caused this infection, it's been resolved. The foreign material has been completely removed. After the doctor left, mother and daughter sat in silence, contemplating the impossible truth that a war fought before Emma was born had nearly claimed her mother's life half a century later. Emma, Sarah said finally, I think it's time we went home and opened that box. Emma nodded, knowing that whatever they found in her father's letters would complete a story that began in a Vietnamese field hospital and had somehow waited 50 years to reach its conclusion. The mystery was deepening, but for the first time since this ordeal began, Emma felt they were moving toward answers rather than away from them. Outside Sarah's hospital window, the Iowa afternoon was giving way to evening, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, the truth waited in a cardboard box that had guarded its secrets for half a century. The drive back to Cedar Falls felt like a pilgrimage to a shrine neither Sarah nor Emma was prepared to visit. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of Emma's rental car, her surgical dressing hidden beneath a soft scarf that Mrs. Kowalski had brought to the hospital. The familiar landscape of Iowa farmland rolled past in autumn splendor, but Sarah's attention was fixed on the cardboard box resting on her lap, the repository of secrets that had waited 50 years to be opened. Emma pulled into the gravel driveway of the farmhouse as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The house looked smaller somehow, as if the weight of approaching revelations had compressed its dimensions. They sat in the car for several minutes, neither woman willing to take the first step toward whatever truth awaited inside. I'm scared, Sarah admitted, her fingers tracing the edges of the box that had sat in her attic like a time bomb with no discernible timer. So am I, Emma replied, surprised by her own honesty. But Mom, what we found in your neck, that DNA evidence, it means these letters might hold answers to questions we didn't even know we should be asking. They entered the house together, the familiar smell of Robert's pipe tobacco still faintly present in the curtains and upholstery, despite 2 years of absence. Sarah moved directly to the kitchen table where Robert had written his mysterious letters, placing the box in the center like an offering to memory. The box itself was unremarkable. Brown cardboard, the kind used for storing Christmas decorations or old photographs. But Sarah's hands shook as she lifted the lid, revealing dozens of handwritten letters tied with a purple ribbon that matched Robert's military decorations. Each envelope was addressed in Robert's careful script. To Sarah, the one I couldn't save. Emma gasped softly. Mom, look at the addresses. He wasn't writing to you. He was writing to her. Sarah lifted the top letter with trembling fingers. The envelope was yellowed with age, the ink slightly faded, but still legible. March 20th, 1969, she read aloud. 5 days after the attack that killed her. Are you ready? Emma asked, her medical training warring with her daughter's instinct to protect her mother from pain. Sarah nodded and carefully opened the first letter. Robert's handwriting filled 3 pages of army stationery, the words cramped and urgent as if he'd been racing against time to capture thoughts that threatened to escape. "My dear Sarah," she began reading aloud, then stopped. "I can't—" "You read it, Emma. I need to hear his words in someone else's voice." Emma took the letter with steady surgeon's hands, though her voice trembled as she began. "My dear Sarah, I know you can't hear these words, but I need to say them anyway. 5 days have passed since I watched you die in my arms, and I can't stop thinking about the last thing you said. You asked me to tell your family that you loved them, but you never told me where to find them. You just said, 'Tell Sarah, tell her I tried to be brave.'" Emma paused, looking at her mother with dawning comprehension. "Mom, she had the same name as you. She was asking Dad to tell someone named Sarah that she tried to be brave." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Keep reading," Emma continued. "I've been thinking about what you said about having a twin sister somewhere in Iowa. You said you were adopted, that you'd always wondered about the family you never knew. You said your adoptive parents told you that your birth parents had kept your twin sister but couldn't afford to raise both children during the Depression." The letter fluttered in Emma's hands as the implications hit her. "Mom, you were adopted, weren't you?" "You've never talked about your birth family." Sarah's face had gone white. "My parents never told me I was adopted, but I always felt incomplete, like part of me was missing." Her voice was barely a whisper. "When I was little, I had an imaginary friend named Sarah. I talked to her constantly. My parents thought it was just childhood fancy." Emma's medical mind raced through genetic probabilities and family histories that suddenly made terrible sense. "Mom, what if it wasn't imaginary? What if you were feeling the absence of your twin sister?" She picked up the next letter, dated a week later. Robert's handwriting had grown more frantic, the words darker and more urgent. "I can't get her blood off my hands. The doctors say it's psychological. There's no blood there anymore. But I can feel it, warm and sticky, like it's soaked into my skin permanently. I tried to save her, Sarah. I tried so hard to keep her heart beating until the medevac arrived. But there was too much shrapnel, too much damage." Emma's voice broke as she read the next paragraph. "The worst part is how much she looked like someone I'm going to love someday. I know that sounds crazy, but when I looked into her eyes as she was dying, I saw my future wife's face. I saw the woman I'm going to marry, the mother of my children, the love of my life. How can I explain to my future wife that I've already lost her once on a battlefield in Vietnam?" Sarah sobbed openly now, the sound raw and broken in the quiet kitchen. "He knew. Somehow, he knew I was her twin before he even met me." Emma continued reading, her own tears blurring the words. "I'm going to find her family when I get home. I'm going to find the other Sarah that this Sarah told me about. I'm going to tell her that her sister died brave, that she died trying to save other people, that she died loved by soldiers who never even knew her name until it was too late." The next letter was dated months later from a veterans hospital in Chicago. "I found her, Sarah. I found your twin sister. Her name is Sarah Elizabeth Miller. The same last name, which means your adoptive family and your birth family both chose that name. She's beautiful, just like you were. She's training to be a nurse, just like you were. When I look at her, I see your face, but alive, breathing, laughing. Is it wrong that I love her because she reminds me of you? Is it wrong that I love you through her?" Emma set the letter down, unable to continue. The truth was too enormous, too impossible to process. "Mom, you weren't just Dad's wife. You were his second chance to save the woman he watched die in Vietnam." Sarah rocked back and forth in her chair, processing 50 years of marriage through this new lens. All those times he looked at me strangely. All those times he seemed to be seeing someone else. He was He was seeing her. Emma picked up another letter, this one from their wedding day in 1972. Today, I married Sarah, the one I could save. She doesn't know about the other Sarah, the one whose blood is still under my fingernails in my dreams. I've decided never to tell her. This love needs to be clean, pure, not haunted by ghosts from a war she didn't fight. The letters continued chronologically through their marriage, Robert's love for Sarah growing deeper and more complex as he struggled with loving a woman who was both herself and a living memorial to someone else. He wrote about Emma's birth, about how holding his daughter had finally helped him forgive himself for not saving the other Sarah. He wrote about buying the farm, about building a life that honored both the woman he'd lost and the woman he'd found. The last letter was dated just days before Robert's death from cancer. His handwriting was weak but determined. My dear Sarah, both of you, I need to tell the truth before I run out of time. The shrapnel that's been in my body for 50 years isn't just mine. Some of it came from the explosion that killed the other Sarah. When I tried to save her, some of her blood got into my wounds. The doctors said it was impossible, but I've carried part of her inside me for our entire marriage. Emma's voice was barely audible as she read the final paragraph. I'm afraid that when I die, I'll take the last trace of her with me. I'm afraid that the other Sarah will be truly dead when I'm gone. But maybe that's okay. Maybe carrying her this long was my real mission. Maybe loving you is how I finally brought her home. Sarah stared at the pile of letters, understanding finally why she'd felt incomplete her entire life, why her marriage had sometimes felt like a triangle with an invisible third person, why Robert had loved her with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Emma, she said quietly, your father didn't just love me. He loved us both. And somehow, we both loved him back. Outside, the Iowa sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, and for the first time in 50 years, Sarah Miller felt complete. The mystery was solved, but the climax of their story was still approaching, hidden in the surgical evidence that proved love could transcend death, time, and medical impossibility. The revelation about Sarah's twin sister should have brought closure, but instead it opened wounds that ran deeper than any surgical incision. Over the following weeks, as Sarah's neck healed and the physical evidence of her ordeal faded to a thin scar, the emotional aftermath threatened to destroy everything she thought she knew about her life. Emma had returned to Chicago, but called daily with updates from her genealogical research. She'd found adoption records confirming that Sarah Elizabeth Miller had indeed been born a twin in 1937. Separated during the Depression when their birth parents could afford to keep only one child. The other twin, also named Sarah, had been adopted by a military family and later enlisted as an Army nurse. The records painted a picture of two lives lived in parallel, both women named Sarah, both dedicated to healing, both destined to love the same man in different ways. But knowledge brought its own torment. Sarah found herself analyzing every moment of her 50-year marriage through the lens of Robert's secret. Had he loved her for herself, or as a replacement for the woman he couldn't save? When he held her, was he holding her or the ghost of a dead nurse from Vietnam? The questions multiplied like cancer cells, eating away at memories that had once brought comfort. The worst part was the growing anger. Sarah had spent decades supporting Robert through his nightmares, his drinking, his long silences that she'd attributed to ordinary war trauma. She'd been patient with his emotional distance, his inability to fully open his heart to their marriage. Now she understood that his heart had been divided from the beginning, part of it buried in a Vietnamese grave, part of it locked away in letters she was never meant to read. Mrs. Kowalski noticed the change first. Sarah stopped attending church, stopped tending her garden, stopped answering the phone when the church ladies called. She spent hours sitting at the kitchen table, Robert's letters spread before her like evidence in a trial she was conducting against her own past. "You're punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault," Mrs. Kowalski said during one of her unannounced visits, finding Sarah still in her nightgown at 2 in the afternoon. "How can you say that?" Sarah's voice was hollow, drained of the warmth that had characterized her for nearly 7 decades. "My entire marriage was built on a lie. Every time he said he loved me, he was really talking to a dead woman. That's not what those letters say, and you know it." Sarah laughed bitterly. "You didn't read them. You don't know what it's like to discover that you've been living as a substitute for someone else your entire adult life." The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in November. Emma had driven down from Chicago for her weekly check on her mother's recovery, finding the house cold and dark despite the early winter chill. Sarah sat in Robert's chair, still wearing the same clothes she'd worn for 3 days, staring at a framed photograph of their wedding day. "Mom, you haven't been taking care of yourself," Emma said, switching on lights and adjusting the thermostat. "Have you eaten today?" Sarah didn't respond, her attention fixed on the wedding photo with an intensity that worried Emma. In the picture, Robert looked handsome in his dress uniform, but Sarah now saw something different in his eyes, a distance that she'd once attributed to camera shyness, but now recognized as the gaze of a man looking through her to see someone else. "I want a divorce," Sarah said suddenly. Emma stopped adjusting the thermote and stared at her mother. "What did you say?" "I want to divorce your father. I know he's dead, but I want it annulled." "I want it erased from the record. I want to pretend it never happened." "Mom, you can't divorce a dead man. And why would you want to? You loved Dad." Sarah finally looked at Emma, her eyes bright with unshed tears and suppressed rage. "I loved a man who didn't exist. The Robert I married was a fiction, a performance he put on to convince himself he could love me instead of her." Emma knelt beside her mother's chair, recognizing the signs of clinical depression that she'd seen in trauma patients. "That's not true, and you know it. Those letters prove he loved you both, in different ways." "Different ways," Sarah repeated mockingly. "He loved her as his lost angel, his perfect martyr who would never age or disappoint him. He loved me as her consolation prize, her earthly replacement. Do you know what it's like to discover that your husband spent 50 years wishing you were someone else?" The conversation escalated into the first real fight Emma and Sarah had ever had. Emma, drawing on her medical training, tried to explain survivor's guilt and the complex psychology of war trauma. Sarah, speaking from the wounded heart of a woman who felt betrayed by her own life, rejected every attempt at rational analysis. "You think you understand because you're a doctor," Sarah said, her voice rising to a pitch Emma had never heard before. "But you weren't there for 50 years of marriage to a man who was emotionally unfaithful with a corpse." Emma's professional composure cracked. "That's not fair. And it's not accurate. Dad loved you. The letters prove it. His actions prove it. He spent 50 years building a life with you, not with her memory." "He built a shrine," Sarah shot back. "I was the altar where he worshipped his dead saint." The argument continued until both women were exhausted, Emma's medical rationality crashing against Sarah's emotional devastation like waves against a seawall. Nothing Emma said could penetrate her mother's conviction that her marriage had been a decades-long deception. After Emma left for Chicago, promising to return the following weekend, Sarah made a decision that would have horrified her daughter. She gathered all of Robert's belongings, his clothes, his Purple Heart, his photographs, his reading glasses, even the coffee cup he'd used every morning, and packed them into boxes for donation to the church rummage sale. She was loading the final box into her car when Mrs. Kowalski appeared, drawn by the unusual activity in the driveway. "Sarah Miller, what in God's name are you doing?" "Cleaning house," Sarah replied curtly. "Getting rid of things I don't need anymore." Mrs. Kowalski examined the boxes, recognizing Robert's belongings. These aren't things, they're memories. You're throwing away 50 years of marriage. I'm throwing away 50 years of lies. The older woman's expression hardened with the authority of someone who'd survived the Depression, World War II, and the loss of her own husband. You listen to me, Sarah Elizabeth Miller. I've known you for 30 years, and I've never seen you act like such a fool. Sarah stiffened. I'm not a fool. I'm a woman who finally understands the truth about her life. The truth? Mrs. Kowalski's voice rose. The truth is that Robert Miller loved you enough to choose you every day for 50 years. The truth is that he could have wallowed in grief for a dead woman, but instead he built a life with a living one. The truth is that you're so busy feeling sorry for yourself that you can't see the gift he gave you. What gift? Being second choice? Being a replacement? Being chosen! Mrs. Kowalski's voice cracked with emotion. My Harold came home from Korea with shrapnel in his leg and nightmares that lasted 20 years. He could have spent our marriage mourning the buddies he lost, but he chose to love me instead. That's what good men do, Sarah. They choose love over grief, hope over despair, the future over the past. Sarah's anger finally boiled over. Your Harold didn't come home carrying another woman's blood under his skin. Your Harold didn't spend your marriage writing love letters to a dead woman. No, Mrs. Kowalski said quietly. But he spent our marriage earning the love of a living one, and so did Robert. That night, alone in the house that felt bigger and emptier than it ever had, Sarah sat among the boxes of Robert's belongings and faced the magnitude of what she was about to lose. Not just the physical remnants of their life together, but the meaning she'd built from 50 years of shared mornings, shared meals, shared silences, and shared love. The tragedy wasn't that Robert had loved another Sarah first. The tragedy was that Sarah was about to destroy the life they'd built together because she couldn't accept that love complex enough to honor both the dead and the living might be the most precious kind of all. As midnight approached, Sarah opened the box containing Robert's Purple Heart and held the medal in her palm, feeling its weight. Not just the medal, but the accumulated gravity of choices made in war and peace, of love chosen daily despite the presence of ghosts, of a man who'd found a way to honor both the Sarah he'd lost and the Sarah he'd found. For the first time since reading the letters, Sarah began to understand that perhaps being Robert's second choice hadn't diminished her worth, it had multiplied it. Emma arrived at the farmhouse the next morning to find her mother standing in the driveway beside boxes of Robert's belongings, her hand wrapped around his Purple Heart like a talisman. Sarah's face showed the ravages of a sleepless night, but something in her posture had changed. The rigid anger of the previous weeks had given way to something that looked almost like wonder. I had a dream, Sarah said without preamble as Emma got out of her car. About your father and the other Sarah. They were together, but not the way I imagined. Emma approached cautiously, recognizing the fragile quality in her mother's voice that suggested breakthrough rather than breakdown. What kind of dream? We were all three in that field hospital in Vietnam. But it wasn't 1969. It was now, today. The other Sarah was dying just like in real life, but this time I was there too. Sarah's eyes focused on something beyond Emma's shoulder, as if she could still see the vision. She looked at me and said, "Take care of him for me. Love him the way I can't." And then she took my hand and put it on his heart, and I felt it. I felt her giving him to me. Emma felt tears welling up, understanding that her mother had found her way to a truth that transcended the simple narrative of betrayal she'd been telling herself. "Mom, what else happened in the dream?" "Your father was crying. Not the way men cry when they're trying to be strong, but like a child who's lost everything. And the other, Sarah, my sister, she touched his face and said, "Don't mourn me, Robert. Love her. Love her enough for both of us." Sarah's voice broke slightly, and then she looked at me again and said, "Sister, he's going to need you to be strong enough to love a man whose heart is big enough for two women. Can you do that?" Emma moved to stand beside her mother, both women staring at the boxes that represented a marriage Sarah had almost discarded in her pain. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her yes. I told her I'd already been doing it for 50 years without knowing it." Sarah laughed softly, the first genuine laughter Emma had heard from her since the surgery. "You know what the strangest part was? In the dream, she looked exactly like me, but she was wearing your father's dog tags. And when I woke up, I realized she wasn't his first love, she was his first loss. There's a difference." Emma felt the pieces of her family's story rearranging themselves into a pattern that honored complexity rather than demanding simple explanations. "What made you realize that?" "Mrs. Kowalski, actually. She came over last night after you left and found me sitting with these boxes ready to throw away 50 years of marriage because I was too proud to share your father's heart with a woman who died before I met him." Sarah picked up Robert's reading glasses, worn smooth by decades of use. "She reminded me that love isn't diminished by being shared. It's multiplied." Emma watched her mother handle Robert's belongings with newfound tenderness, seeing the shift from rejection to reintegration happening in real time. "So, what changed your mind about the divorce?" "I realized I was trying to punish your father for loving too much instead of too little. I was angry at him for having a heart big enough to honor the dead and love the living at the same time." Sarah held up the Purple Heart, its purple ribbon catching the morning light. "This medal represents his sacrifice in war. But our marriage was his sacrifice for peace. He could have spent his life mourning her, but he chose to spend it loving me." Emma helped her mother carry the boxes back into the house, each item returning to its rightful place in the constellation of memory that made up their family home. Robert's coffee cup went back to its place by the sink. His reading glasses returned to the table beside his chair. The Purple Heart found its way back to the kitchen drawer, but this time Sarah left the drawer slightly open, no longer hiding it like a shameful secret. As they worked, Emma found the courage to voice the question that had been haunting her since the discovery. "Mom, do you think Dad knew about you being her twin?" Sarah paused in the act of hanging Robert's favorite flannel shirt back in the closet. "I think he suspected. There were too many coincidences. The name, the nursing, the way I looked. But I don't think he ever wanted to know for certain." "Why not?" "Because then he'd have to choose between loving me for myself and loving me as her replacement. By not knowing for sure, he could love me as both, the woman I was and the woman she might have been." Sarah smoothed the shirt sleeves with careful attention. "It was kinder that way, for all of us." The afternoon brought Dr. Reynolds for a follow-up appointment, checking on Sarah's surgical site and overall recovery. The infection had cleared completely, leaving only a thin scar that Sarah no longer tried to hide. But the doctor's real concern was for Sarah's emotional state, which had clearly worried Emma enough to prompt the visit. "How are you processing everything you've learned?" Dr. Reynolds asked, her tone carrying the careful neutrality of someone trained to navigate complex family dynamics. "Better," Sarah said simply. "I spent weeks being angry at my husband for loving two women. Now I'm grateful that he was the kind of man whose heart was big enough for both of us." Dr. Reynolds nodded approvingly. "Grief and discovery often trigger anger before they lead to acceptance. You've been processing not just medical trauma, but the revelation that your understanding of your own life story was incomplete." "More than incomplete," Emma interjected. We discovered that Mom was literally carrying part of her twin sister's DNA in her body, transferred through 50 years of marriage to a man who'd tried to save that sister in Vietnam. Dr. Reynolds leaned forward with renewed interest. How are you interpreting that now? The physical evidence of that connection. Sarah considered the question carefully. I think my body was trying to tell me something my mind wasn't ready to understand. The infection forced us to discover the truth about my sister, about Robert's war, about the love story that was bigger than any of us realized. And how do you feel about that truth now? Honored, Sarah said without hesitation. I spent 50 years thinking I was just Robert's wife. Now I know I was both his wife and his chance at redemption. I was how he finally brought my sister home. Dr. Reynolds made notes in Sarah's chart, but Emma could see the doctor was moved by her mother's transformation. Mrs. Miller, you've shown remarkable resilience throughout this ordeal, not just physically but emotionally. Sarah laughed. Doctor, I'm 70 years old. I've buried my parents, my husband, and half my friends, but I've never buried a sister I didn't know I had. That was new. As Dr. Reynolds prepared to leave, she turned back with one final observation. Mrs. Miller, in 40 years of medicine, I've learned that sometimes the body keeps secrets the mind isn't ready to handle. Your infection may have been your body's way of insisting that some truths can't stay buried forever. Emma walked the doctor to her car, grateful for the professional perspective on her mother's recovery. Doctor, do you really think it's medically possible for DNA from my father's war experience to have been preserved in my mother's body for 50 years? Dr. Reynolds considered the question seriously. Emma, I've seen stranger things in medicine than love transcending conventional biological boundaries. Whether it happened through blood transfer, tissue contact, or some mechanism we don't understand yet, the evidence was there. Your mother's body was telling a story her mind didn't know existed. That evening, Sarah and Emma sat together in the kitchen where Robert had written his secret letters, sharing the dinner they'd prepared from his mother's recipe for pot roast. The letters themselves had been returned to their box, but this time Sarah placed the box on the shelf beside Robert's Purple Heart, visible reminders of a love story complex enough to honor both the living and the dead. Emma, Sarah said as they cleaned the dishes together, I want to do something to honor your father and my sister. Something that acknowledges what they meant to each other and what they meant to us. Emma dried the dishes with one of the tea towels Robert had brought back from Germany during a business trip in the 1980s. What did you have in mind? I want to go to Vietnam. I want to see the place where she died and he lived. I want to thank them both for the love they gave me, even when I was too hurt to recognize it as a gift. Emma smiled, seeing in her mother's plan the kind of healing journey that honored complexity rather than demanding simple resolution. When do we leave? We? Sarah looked surprised. Mom, this is a family story. All three of us, you, me, and the sister we never knew, we're all part of it now. I think it's time we went to Vietnam together and finally brought everyone home. As they finished cleaning the kitchen, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced since Robert's death, a sense of completeness that came not from having all the answers, but from finally asking the right questions. The reversal was complete. What had begun as betrayal had been revealed as the deepest kind of fidelity, and what had felt like replacement had proven to be multiplication. The truth had set them all free. 6 months later, Sarah Elizabeth Miller stood at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., her finger tracing the engraved name, Sarah Elizabeth Miller, on the black granite wall. The spring morning was crisp and clear, cherry blossoms blooming around the memorial like promises of renewal. Emma stood beside her, one hand resting protectively on her mother's shoulder, the other holding a small bouquet of Iowa wildflowers they'd picked from Sarah's garden that morning. The pilgrimage to Vietnam had been transformative, But it was here, on American soil, that Sarah finally felt the circle close. They'd spent 2 weeks in Southeast Asia, visiting the site where Cu Chi had once stood, now peaceful farmland growing rice where a field hospital had burned 50 years ago. Local villagers had helped them locate the exact spot where Robert's unit had been overrun, and Sarah had knelt in the red earth, placing flowers on ground that had drunk her sister's blood and shaped her husband's heart. But it was the moment she'd stood in that Vietnamese field and felt her sister's presence, not as a rival for Robert's love, but as the guardian angel who'd guided him home to the woman who would complete his healing, that Sarah understood the true gift her family had been given. Love, she'd learned, wasn't diminished by being shared across time and death. It was sanctified by it. "I brought you something," Sarah whispered to the name on the wall, reaching into her purse for the small wooden box she'd carried across 2 continents. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was Robert's purple heart. "He wanted you to have this. He said so in his letters." He said the medal belonged to the nurse who died saving others, not the medic who lived to love again. Emma watched her mother place the purple heart at the base of the memorial wall, understanding that this wasn't an abandonment of Robert's memory, but a completion of his final mission. For 50 years, he'd carried guilt about surviving when his patient didn't. Now, through Sarah's act of tribute, that guilt could finally rest. A gentle voice behind them interrupted the sacred moment. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Miller?" They turned to find an elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap, his eyes bright with recognition and something deeper. Hope, perhaps, or the kind of joy that comes from unexpected answers to long-held questions. "I am," Sarah replied, studying the stranger's face for clues to his identity. "My name is James Patterson, no relation to your doctor back home," he said with a slight smile. "I served in the same unit as Robert Miller. I was there the night both Sarahs entered his life." Emma felt her breath catch. This man was a living witness to the story that had reshaped their understanding of their family's history. "You knew my husband?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew them both," James replied gently. "Robert and the nurse. I was the one who helped carry her to the aid station when the shelling started. I was there when Robert tried to save her life." He paused, his eyes moving to the purple heart at the base of the wall. "And I've been looking for you for 50 years. Sarah stared at the veteran, her mind struggling to process this impossible convergence. "Looking for me? Why?" James reached into his jacket and withdrew a small, weathered envelope. "Because she gave me something to give to her family before she died. She said she had a twin sister named Sarah in Iowa, and she made me promise to find you if I ever made it home." With trembling hands, Sarah accepted the envelope that had waited half a century to reach its intended recipient. Her name was written on the front in unfamiliar handwriting, her sister's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a small black and white photograph. "My dearest sister," Sarah read aloud, Emma leaning close to hear the words that had traveled across 5 decades to reach them. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home from this place. I don't know if you even know I exist. Our adoptive parents never told me if you were told about me, but I felt you my whole life like a missing piece of my heart." Sarah's voice broke, but she continued reading. "I became a nurse because I dreamed of healing people the way I always imagined you would heal me if we were together. I joined the army because I wanted to serve something bigger than myself, the way I imagined you would serve your community. I've lived my whole life trying to be worthy of the sister I hope to find someday." Emma wiped tears from her eyes as her mother continued. "If something happens to me here, I want you to know that I died happy because I finally met someone who reminded me of you. There's a medic here named Robert Miller who has kind eyes and gentle hands, and when he looks at me, I imagine it's how you would look at me if we were ever reunited. If I don't make it home, I hope you find him. I hope you love him the way I would have loved to love someone like him. I hope you build the family that I'll never get to build." Sarah looked up at James Patterson, her eyes swimming with tears. She knew. Somehow she knew. James nodded. "She talked about you constantly. Said she felt like half a person, like her other half was somewhere in Iowa growing corn and waiting for her to come home. When Robert told us his hometown was Cedar Falls, she made me promise to find the Sarah Miller who lived there and give her this letter." Sarah turned the envelope over and found the photograph, a picture of her sister in her Army nurse uniform standing next to a young Robert Miller in his medic's fatigues. They looked like brother and sister or close friends, nothing romantic in their poses, but what took Sarah's breath away was how much her sister looked like Emma at the same age. "Oh my God," Emma whispered, studying the photograph. "She looks exactly like me when I was young." James smiled. "That's what Robert said when he first met your mother. He said it was like watching his lost friend come back to life, but with 20 years of wisdom and joy that war couldn't touch." Sarah felt the final pieces of her family's puzzle clicking into place. "He didn't fall in love with me because I reminded him of her. He fell in love with me because he recognized that I was her, the same soul given a second chance at the life she never got to live." Emma hugged her mother tightly, both women crying now with the joy of understanding rather than the pain of confusion. "Mom, don't you see? You weren't his second choice or his consolation prize. You were his miracle. You were her gift to him and his gift to her." James Patterson had his own tears flowing as he witnessed the reunion he'd waited 50 years to facilitate. "There's one more thing," he said softly. "Your sister made me promise to tell you that if anything happened to her, she wanted you to live twice as much, once for yourself and once for her. She said to love twice as hard, laugh twice as loud, and be twice as brave as you thought possible." Sarah looked at the Purple Heart resting at the base of the memorial wall, then at the photograph of her sister and her husband, then at her daughter who carried the genetic legacy of both the Sarah who died and the Sarah who lived. "I think I've been doing that without knowing it," she said finally. "I think we all have." As they prepared to leave the memorial, Sarah felt compelled to speak once more to the name on the wall. "Thank you, sister. Thank you for sending him home to me. Thank you for the 50 years of love you made possible. Thank you for the daughter we raised together and the granddaughter I'm going to meet next month." Emma smiled through her tears. "Granddaughter? I can feel it," Sarah said with the certainty of a woman who'd learned to trust the wisdom of her body and heart. "She's going to be another Sarah, and she's going to be beautiful and brave and whole in ways that honor all of us." They walked away from the memorial together, 3 generations of women shaped by love that had survived war, death, separation, and the passage of half a century. Behind them, Robert's Purple Heart caught the morning sun, a small tribute to the idea that some sacrifices create more love than they cost, and some losses lead to discoveries that transform grief into gratitude. Mrs. Kowalski had been right, Sarah realized. The truth wasn't that Robert had loved 2 women. The truth was that love had been so strong it had found a way to survive death, cross oceans, and create a family that honored both the Sarah who died for others and the Sarah who lived for love. As they drove back toward Iowa, toward the farmhouse where Robert's letters waited in their box and his coffee cup still sat by the sink, Sarah felt complete for the first time in her 70 years. She wasn't half a person waiting for her missing twin to make her whole. She was 2 people in one body, herself and her sister, living the life they'd both dreamed of, loving the man they'd both trusted with their hearts. The ending had become a beginning, and the family story that had nearly been destroyed by too much truth had been saved by enough love to honor all of it. Dear friends, Sarah Miller's story reminds us that love isn't diminished by complexity. It's deepened by it. At 70, Sarah discovered that her 50-year marriage wasn't built on deception, but on a love so profound it honored both the living and the dead. Her husband Robert didn't love two women. He loved with such integrity that he carried the memory of a fallen nurse home to the twin sister she'd never met, creating a family that spanned battlefields and decades. Sometimes what feels like betrayal is actually the deepest form of faithfulness. Sometimes the love we think isn't enough for us is actually more than we ever dared hope for. Sarah's journey from anger to acceptance teaches us that our greatest pain often guards our greatest treasure. The understanding that we are loved not despite our complications but because of them. True love doesn't demand simplicity. It embraces the beautiful messiness of hearts big enough to honor the past while building the future. In your own marriages, families, and friendships, have you discovered that love grows stronger when it's shared rather than hoarded? What family stories have you uncovered that changed how you understood your own love story? Share your thoughts below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Have you ever discovered a family secret that changed how you understood your relationships? What helped you find peace with complex truths about love in your own life?